think the story of Ukraine in the 1990s is, in some respects, a general post-Soviet story, that all of the countries that emerged from the wreckage of the Soviet Union were struggling with poverty, were struggling with getting on their feet and getting bills paid and, sort of getting things going. And that's largely the story of the 1990s. I think things stabilize as they do across the region by around 2000. And then what you get in Ukraine is a kind of vacillation with an orientation toward Russia at certain times under certain kinds of leadership and an orientation toward Europe under other kinds of leadership. That's a fairly gentle oscillation. It's not a dramatic or even painful oscillation. One could say perhaps until 2004, when you have the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. This was a revolution that people mounted to protest a rigged election. And there you start to see a sharpening sense that Russia really wants certain outcomes in Ukraine. Ukrainians don't always agree or don't primarily agree with the kinds of outcomes that Russia wants. And that's, in microcosm, the problem that begins to take shape already in 2004. 10 years later, or 9 years later, you have the Maidan uprising, which is about many things in Ukraine. It's about corruption, it's about better governance, but it's also about an orientation toward Europe. And that's consolidated by the spring of 2014. Zelensky emerges as an extremely capable and charismatic wartime leader. Ukraine suffers terribly under the war, is suffering terribly under the war, as we all know, but has maintained a unified political position about remaining a democracy and about orienting itself toward Europe and, in security terms, toward the United States. So it's a long evolution. It doesn't go in only one direction from 1991 to the present, but the last 10 years of it, you could say even going back to 2004, the trajectory, the westward trajectory, has been pretty apparent. Negotiation as such is something that governments do during wartime. Sometimes it's about very practical concerns. It can grow larger than that, but it makes sense for there to be certain channels of communication between Kiev and Moscow. But your question is about territorial concessions and negotiation that would sort of grant Russia a permanent position on Ukrainian soil. And that would be deeply unwise and imprudent for Ukraine. Not really that anybody in Ukraine is calling for this, although there's a degree of weariness that is setting in. And I think that there's sort of two basic reasons why this is a problem for Ukraine. One is that you can't negotiate away your country, and the scale of Russian ambitions is very great. So you can't concede 1/3 of Russia's ambitions, knowing that the other 2/3 are sort of waiting in potential. The second point is maybe a little bit more pragmatic, and it's a historical point. So in 2014, 2015, Ukraine never accepted the annexation of Crimea, nor did Ukraine accept this Russian military presence in Donetsk and Luhansk in eastern Ukraine. But there was a negotiation over not Crimea, but over eastern Ukraine or the Donbass. Two agreements signed in Minsk, the capital of Belarus, in 2014, and then in 2015. What happens to Ukraine in 2022 is that Russia invades from Crimea, and Russia also invades from eastern Ukraine. So the territory that was not quite granted, but the territory that Russia remained in control of, is the territory that Russia used for a successive invasion. And I don't think that Ukraine can get out of that bind. If you would grant Russia twice as much territory, Ukraine faces the prospect of Russia invading in the future from that territory. So that's a logistical, military, and practical problem that feeds into these larger questions. So we could say the transatlantic world, the Western world, if you will, is supporting Ukraine, but it's a coalition that's actually considerably larger than that. And it includes many of the world's wealthiest and technologically most sophisticated countries. So Ukraine has a very extensive and very powerful coalition behind it. I don't think it's possible, switching over to Russia, to say Russia has a coalition behind it. I don't think it's structured in that way. What Russia has is China, India, Brazil, South Africa as countries that are still very vigorously trading with Russia, not involved in the sanctions regime connected to the war. And so Russia is deriving enormous income from the sale of gas and oil and other commodities to these countries, and that income is being used to fuel the war. Finally, and this is the kind of Cold War story, you have a lot of non-aligned countries. Maybe this takes us back to sort of India and countries that are still trading with Russia, but probably don't really like the war, but a lot of countries that are not eager to render judgment on the war. And this has been an important factor in the United Nations, multilateral institutions, where I think, to the disappointment of Ukraine, the United States, European partners, there just hasn't been as much of a global groundswell of support for Ukraine as people had hoped. And this is, again, not out of direct admiration for Russia or agreement with Russia, but a sort of entrenched and very widespread posture of non-alignment. I think that we have to acknowledge historically that there are a lot of conflicts in the world that can become chronic. Maybe, sort of India, Pakistan. Obviously, Arab-Israeli conflict has been ongoing since the 1920s and the 1930s in different forms and in different configurations. And I don't think that that's impossible in this case, that, Russia may pull back and then return to the war. If there's a clear end to the war, it's going to end by some political shift in Russia itself. Either Putin will lose power in a way that destabilizes the Kremlin, Russian population will fragment in its support for the war. Other political movements and initiatives could break out. And if we think that this is impossible, and at times it does feel impossible when you look at the quote unquote impregnable fortress that Russia is or pretends to be, we do have to remember that the Prigozhin uprising of last June was something pretty remarkable. Third possible outcome, we've spoken of a kind of unending war or conflict over decades and generations. Russia, in some sense, being unable to perpetuate the war. If you have a kind of in-between, that the active fighting starts to die down, I think that here we have very positive scenarios for Ukraine's reconstruction, development as a country, integration into European and transatlantic institutions. And this will mean that there will be some territory that's under Russian control, that there will be a line of contact. That line of contact will have its own built-in instability, but it will also be controlled. International order clearly, and European order, resides on the territorial integrity and sovereignty of states, big and small, rich and poor, weak and strong. And so in this sense, that's a matter of principle. Ukraine is only one of many such countries that's wrestling with that problem of its territorial integrity. But it's a very important precedent that is being set and that will be set, and that matters for Europe. And in a sense, it matters for all of us.